So just to clarify, we actually conducted 3 methods. So we assessed University Modern Slavery Act reports. We analysed survey data that was collected by CAF from 19 university respondents, which accounts for most universities across Australia. And then I conducted interviews to try to compare that data that we'd collected with more nuanced information from the people who are responsible for procurement within universities. So the really good news, I think, to start off with, is that all survey and interview participants indicated a very strong commitment to addressing the labour conditions of cleaners and security guards. So that's great. The survey respondents on average rated their level of confidence that cleaners and security guards are being paid correctly at all times at 4 out of 5. So pretty high levels of confidence there. But that confidence is probably misdirected, because what we know from about the conditions of cleaners and security guards is that widespread underpayment is a big problem in the sector. So I guess our first really significant finding is that there probably isn't a good understanding of the problems that workers face in the industry. There were some interviewees that showed a really good, strong, nuanced understandings of the problem. For example, one interviewee said, cleaning is one of our largest categories, full stop, in terms of service category, and we know there's been a lot of underpayment in this area and we want to do the right thing. So there are universities where the personnel have a very strong understanding, but on average, we're not there yet in terms of understanding the problems that security guards and cleaners face. There was also a poor understanding of the causes of labour abuses. So, for example, in our survey, only a few respondents chose high workloads or a lack of training as causes of labour abuses, whereas with surveys of workers and of studies of labour conditions in these sectors, we know that the main cause of low payment is overtime, unpaid overtime, and that lack of training and equipment is a really significant cause of health and safety breaches. The good news again is that survey respondents believe that universities and contractors have the most power to improve working conditions. But then this was contradicted by other data that we collected that found that most of the respondents saw the problem lying outside universities, so that they think the problem is probably incorrect payment that the contractor has made, or that there's been further subcontracting. And I want to finish just my summary of our findings by saying that we also found that there's no standardised method within universities of ensuring compliance with labour standards. No method of checking and verifying labour standards within supply chains, the supply chains within which cleaning and security occurs. And although there are embryonic processes that universities have started to put in place in the last few years, they're largely untested. And there hasn't been a good comparison amongst universities. There's not a sound enough conversation going on about how to do that work yet, although there is a movement towards that with the AUPN. I want to come back to that point later in this discussion, if that's all right with you, Martin.
No, of course, that's fine. And AUPN obviously stands for the Australian Universities Procurement Network, for those not familiar with that. 2 quick follow-up questions there for you, Shelley. So firstly, it's obviously interesting to see the, I suppose, discrepancy between the survey that indicates a high sort of degree of, trust in the fact that entitlements and everything else is sort of, arranged properly. And on the other hand, sort of, I suppose, the findings that indicate, the opposite. So could you talk a little bit to perhaps the lack of oversight that perhaps results in this discrepancy? And then secondly, also, could you indicate when your report is going to be made public so that everyone else can sort of read it in more detail as well?
Great. Well, I might address the second point first. So I believe that CAF will distribute both the reports after this meeting to all of the attendees. So, and I should say that I did share earlier versions with all of the interviewees who were so kind about giving their time. In terms of your first question, I think the problem, at the heart of the problem, is that there's been an outsourcing of these functions from universities. So, for example, cleaning and security used to be things that were done in-house within universities, and they've been outsourced, and that was done with great enthusiasm. And then following that process of outsourcing, there was then a kind of layering onto that steps for trying to address labour standards, when it became clear that that was a problem and that universities had lost control of that issue by outsourcing these functions. And so there's been a lag. Universities have not yet put in place the right tools for verifying labour standards. And as perhaps I'll talk about a little bit more later on, one of the things that's happened with that outsourcing is that they no longer have a direct relationship with unions or with workers. They're not using worker voice mechanisms, which are the strongest mechanisms for addressing labour abuses, because of that outsourcing, although the workers are still doing the work on campuses. So they're still physically present, but they're contractually distant. And that has changed the tools that universities are using to address labour abuses.
Thanks, Shelley. I might move on to you now, Chris. So we heard a bit from Shelley about the role that sort of lead companies or companies at the apex of supply chains can play in influencing the working conditions that cleaners or security guards experience. Could you talk a little bit more to the ways in which lead firms can be influential in that area, and perhaps are there also some examples that you could give of instances where lead firms have indeed exercised that influence?
Yeah, thanks, Martijn, and thanks to you and to Poonam and to CAF for inviting me to be part of this great initiative. So I think rather than giving examples, I might give some principles that are based on the research that you and Laurie and Shelley and other researchers have done. That might be more relatable, I think, to participants in this forum. So that, there are a lot of case studies out there of good practice and bad practice, and I think these are, say, 3 principles that kind of emerge from that body of research that's been done. So the first is that, and some of these really reinforce what Shelley has already said. So the first is that an organisation's responsibilities to workers don't stop with its employees. So they extend to all workers of the businesses that an organisation relies upon and deals with to develop its services or its products. And this means that organisations need to conceptualise their workforce, not in terms of the legal boundary of their workforce, not in terms of who are the direct employees of my organisation, but all the workers who contribute to that organisation. That means the employees and the contractors of subcontractors rather of the contractors for, in this case, cleaning or security that the organisation engages. And I think this principle of conceptualising the workforce beyond the legal boundaries of the organisation to all the workers that the organisation engages with directly or indirectly is important for ensuring that workers are paid and treated decently. The second principle is for organisations to recognise their power as lead firms or lead organisations that are able to exert power through their commercial engagements over their supply chain or the contracting chain. And this requires organisations to not assume necessarily that the contractors are the problem for any breaches of labour standards. Poor labour standards might be the result of the terms of the commercial contract. As Shelley was alluding to, in many universities across Australia, cleaners were employed directly, they've been outsourced, and the outsourcing process was often done through tendering processes based on cost. So cost is a legitimate factor for contracting and procurement, but if the tender is awarded to the contractor who offers their services at the lowest cost, the reason they might be offering the lowest cost is because they're not treating their workers decently, or they're not paying them in compliance with their obligations under the law. But organisations, like universities, like to see themselves as socially responsible organisations, need to, if they want to uphold that image that they promote to the wider public, that needs to be reflected in the terms of their contracts. Decent work, compliance, these have to be fundamental principles of the contracting process. And related to that, there's a lot of discussion in the wider literature, academic research has been done around this, is that arrangements with contractors, rather than being competitive or transactional, what can you give for me at the lowest cost, and we don't really care what you do in the business to deliver on that promise, they should be instead relational or more collaborative. Longer term arrangements whereby organisations work with their contractors in delivering those services, and that will give the lead organisation better oversight over the practices of the contractors and be able to work with them to remedy any problems that arise. And the third, and I think perhaps most important principle, and this goes directly to something that Shelley said, it means the third principle is working with worker organisations like trade unions to ensure that contractors are complying with the law. Don't rely on contractors telling you that they're doing the right thing, that they're complying with their legal obligations. Some have a vested interest in cutting corners. Some might not be aware that they're not complying over things like overtime, which can often be a bit technical in how those arrangements work out. So I think those three principles are three consistent findings that emerge from research in contracting of services like cleaning, but also in other industries as well.
Thanks for that, Chris. If I can ask a quick follow-up there. So in those situations where you would, where a lead company would ignore, I suppose, those three principles that you just outlined, can you, and you would just sort of take the word of your cleaning contractor or whatever contractor you have and just leave it at that. What are some of the risks that are associated with that? In terms of not only the risk, I suppose, of obviously workers not getting paid their entitlements or being overworked, but are there also sort of reputational elements associated with that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think when the reputational damage that can be made, it can arise for the lead firm when a contractor isn't complying is evident in so many different industries and contexts. So if your organisations that have those transactional arrangements simply rely upon what the contractor tells them, if there's non-compliance occurring, then that is going to come up, and often it comes up in quite spectacular and damaging ways. And I think this also goes back to the issue of the importance of working with unions and other work organisations. If you have a good relationship with unions, if you're working with them to help identify any problems of non-compliance or other issues, this can be a way of avoiding those reputational damages that can occur. I think these three best practice instances, they're interconnected. Having a good relationship and relational arrangements with your suppliers should also be extended to the representatives of the workforce through unions. So having that that those trust, more collaborative arrangements rather than more cost competitive ones is ultimately going to be beneficial for avoiding those issues like non-compliance and reputational damage.
Thanks, Chris. And I think that's one of the areas where CAF is really becoming a brand where rather than sort of, companies experiencing reputational damage, they actually experience a reputational boost or a reputational bonus by being involved in CAF. Laurie, I might turn to you next. Just a question in relation to your area of expertise, which is, around migrant labor. Now, we know that so many of the cleaners working on university campuses are obviously international students or are temporary visa holders. Could you speak a bit to sort of the, I suppose, the difficulties that brings and what makes those workers more vulnerable on that basis, and how that might be challenging in terms of trying to enforce decent working conditions in those contexts?
Absolutely. Thanks, Martijn. And thanks, Poonam, as well, and CAF for having me also here. So perhaps, Martijn, I'll answer you with sort of reference to two studies that we did, surveying sort of thousands of temporary migrants in Australia. So in 2016, with my colleague Bettina Farbenbloem, we conducted a survey of over 4,300 temporary migrants with over more than 100 nationalities in every region in every state and territory in Australia, and a range of jobs. Most of the participants were international students. And among the temporary migrants, mainly international students, but also backpackers who worked as cleaners, almost a third, 29%, reported that they earned less than $12 an hour in that job, which, was approximately half the casual minimum wage at the time. And over a half received $15 an hour or less, which was sort of well under the casual minimum wage at the time. And I should say, we asked about underpayment, and we asked about a range of other exploitation, and survey respondents reported other forms of exploitation while working as cleaners. For instance, across the whole cohort, 173 participants reported paying a sum of money. So that was 5% of everyone reported paying a deposit to get their job, and 15% of those were cleaners, were paid that deposit while they were cleaners. And again, overall, 5%, 168 participants reported that their passport was confiscated during their job, and 10% of those reported that happened while they were cleaners. So, clearly some of the, indicators of forced labour, frankly, are occurring while international students and backpackers are working as cleaners. Several years later, in 2019, we conducted another anonymous online survey of over 5,000 international students this time. And basically, long story short, the wage rates were the same, that they, similar proportions were earning basically half, a quarter were earning half the casual minimum wage. And 3/4 were earning under the minimum wage. So just really serious underpayment is persisting across, the entire population of temporary migrant workers in this country. Now, in terms of your question, Martijn, about vulnerabilities, we asked temporary visa holders who were underpaid why they hadn't taken action. And we asked whether they took action, and 90%, so 9 in 10 said that they didn't take any action when they were underpaid, even though when we told them the minimum wage, so they knew they were underpaid, they said, no, we didn't do anything about it. And when we asked why you hadn't done anything about it, a quarter said it was because of their visa, that they were concerned about consequences for their visa. And as many of the participants in this workshop will know, international students typically have a condition on their visa that restricts them to working 40 hours a fortnight while course is in session. And many have been working more than that for years. I should say that condition has been relaxed this year during COVID, but, is likely to be reinstated. And I think that for those students who are worried that, they have been working in breach of their visa conditions, they have been, trying to meet all their university fees and pay for their to live in Australia. They've been working more than they've been permitted. They're aware of that, and they will not come forward because for them, the absolute most important thing is their visa, and they do not want to put that at risk in any way. I just want to, it's not just, I guess, just in finishing up, Martijn, it's not just those students, though, who actually have breached their visa conditions, you know, of which there are probably many. But in our latest survey, we actually asked international students in more detail about what they understood about that visa condition and their rights and obligations. And we found that they fear that their visa may be cancelled and are reluctant to come and report underpayment or other labour contraventions because they believe that they have broken the law in certain respects, and that are actually not true. So first of all, we found that the vast majority believe that they've broken the law when they agree to receive wages that are less than the lawful minimum. And I'll, you know, they are aware of what the minimum wage is, and they believe that they have broken the law when they receive less than that, even though in fact, that's not the case. It's obviously an employer's obligation, legal obligation to pay the correct wage. It is not the worker's obligation to receive the correct wage, but they believe they've broken the law if they have, and they believe so only 1 in 5 were aware that that wasn't the case. And so they think that just even by accepting underpayment might put their visa at risk, when in fact that isn't the case. And similarly, the majority believe that accepting wages in cash may somehow lead them to have broken the law and may put their visa at risk, when in fact, again, it actually is not unlawful to pay wages in cash as an employer. It's not unlawful to receive wages in cash. Of course, you do have the obligation to pay tax, but that's separate. And but these international students, you know, fewer than a third knew that accepting wages in cash does not mean that they've broken the law and does not put their visa at risk. So there are this litany of other, I mean, and they're just the questions that we are. So, you know, I think there's much more research to be done on all the other things that students think may put their visa at risk that is in fact not true, which compounds, of course, the reasons that they know that do put their visa at risk, for instance, when they have worked more hours than they're permitted. And so I think that, you know, I mean, fear of immigration consequences overall is a very strong silencing force among this population of workers and makes them very vulnerable to underpayment, because I think the employers know as well that you know that's the case, and can take advantage of that vulnerability.
Thanks, Laurie. And you mentioned the sort of working restriction and limited number of hours that international students could normally work in a fortnight. Obviously, that's been relaxed in the context of the pandemic, and you mentioned that it might be reinstated. That would, I suppose, in the context of the current cost of living crisis and the fact that obviously cost of living in many the cities in Australia is already really high, you know, a potential, you know, going back to that working restriction, would that, you know, I mean, I suppose asking the question is answering the question, that seems to really exacerbate the risk of exploitation there as well, because with rising costs, well, how could you possibly, you know, meet your, you know, your fees, student fees, and other demands while only working 40 hours a fortnight?
Look, I mean, I think that's right. And especially also during COVID, where perhaps the parents of international student back home have been, you know, have experienced a downturn in business or income and other things during, you know, sort of foreign lockdowns. I think there has been a real, you know, financial crisis experienced by international students. But I also, and I think that, I mean, that's right, Martijn, and especially when they're being underpaid. So there's a vicious cycle that, you know, when a student is earning $12 an hour, you know, yeah, I mean, you especially can't live on 20 hours, you know, 20 hours of that a week. And so that also compels students to accept more hours, which again, I think, you know, certain like unscrupulous employers can know and take advantage of. But it does occur just anyway. And the employer may not be aware of it, although they may, but it certainly means that students are very, very fearful about bringing what, you know, that underpayment or other issues with working conditions to anyone's attention.
Thanks for that, Laurie. Shelley, I might move to you. And I've got a question that relates a bit to the Modern Slavery Act that was introduced in Australia. And as many of you will be aware, a very similar act, also called Modern Slavery Act, was introduced in the United Kingdom in 2015. So from Australian shores, we've been able to look at what's been happening in the UK a bit. And indeed, some of the recent peer-reviewed research coming out of the UK has actually looked at the reporting done by UK universities under the UK Modern Slavery Act. Now, when the act was introduced in the UK, and indeed a lot of that thinking was similar in Australia, the idea was that a race to the top would occur. Basically, you know, companies and organizations that had to report could show their modern slavery credentials. They could show what they were doing in that space to address those risks, etc. And they would be sort of competing to sort of, you know, be the best of the best and be at the top of the, you know, top ranked, basically, reporter on this particular issues. Now, what research has found in the UK is that specifically amongst UK universities, we've not actually seen that race to the top. So they've not been trying to outdo each other by out-reporting each other on these particular issues. Does that mean that we should expect the same to happen in Australia, or can we expect more from our Australian universities?
Great question. So we, as I said, we assessed all the modern slavery statements that were lodged by Australian universities. But from the outset, I want to say not all universities that were required to lodge a report even lodged a report. And then universities are required to report on not just their operations and supply chains, but also those of their subsidiaries. And a big gap was that universities failed to report on their subsidiaries. So I guess I want to state that from the outset. Our research finds that, I'm not sure if you would call it a race to the top, but definitely universities are taking the Modern Slavery Act seriously, in the sense that they care a lot about it. So I don't want for a moment to undermine that. And comparing that also with our interview data, you know, everyone I interviewed said that there was buy-in from university leadership about the Modern Slavery Act. The problem is that it's not being sufficiently resourced, and that there's a limited understanding of the risks that lead to modern slavery and how to address it. So what that means is that the commitment that's, I think, and the buy-in isn't playing out in terms of the standard of reporting. So we found a really high variance in the types of disclosures that were being made. And when the audience sees our report, you'll see that there were some universities that did really well and some that did very, very poorly. And so that there's a really big difference between universities. And I guess compared with other sectors, for example, the university sector on average is doing worse than garment and seafood sectors. And that might be because the garment sector has been in the spotlight for so long about labour abuses and so forth, about on par with horticulture and glove manufacturing sectors in terms of the quality of reporting. So that means just meeting, for example, the mandatory requirements under the Act, and then going beyond that in certain respects. So the areas that are most concerned, I would say, is that universities failed to address, I mean, none of the universities reported having a formal remediation process. They didn't have corrective action plans in place, so they didn't say what they were going to do if they found modern slavery in their operations or supply chains. And they didn't report on how their grievance mechanism, if they had one, was going to address modern slavery. On the upside, at least 2/3 of the universities included in their evaluation cleaning as a high-risk sector. And as Laurie has just presented, you know, there are so many risk factors for cleaners of modern slavery, but that still means a third of the universities overlooked cleaning as a problem. And what is worrying about that is not just that it is a high-risk sector, but also that it's a sector that universities can do something about far more easily than they can address the risks in sectors where the subcontracting is in another country. You know, these are workers that are on their very campuses. So they have tools and the power to address the conditions of cleaners that they just don't have as readily for geographically distant workers. And here again, I just want to come back to just the fact that universities, in terms of what they report in their modern slavery reports, and also this played out in the survey and the interviews, they're just not using the tools that would help to address modern slavery. So they're carrying out audits of their suppliers, but as Chris said, asking your suppliers whether they're complying with the Modern Slavery Act or adhering to labour laws isn't going to give you verifiable information about the actual labour standards. And although in our survey, for example, respondents felt that consultation with the United Workers Union, that the union had power, they only 5% thought that it was a preferable way of addressing labour standards was to deal with the union. 5% of all our respondents. So yeah, again, I think there's buy-in. There's certainly, we're not seeing a race to the top, but we're not seeing a disregard for the Modern Slavery Act. I just don't think that universities are resourcing or putting in place the mechanisms that they need to put in place to address the problem.
Thanks, Shelley. Just Chris, so Shelley mentioned a few things, you know, and the one that I want to zoom in on here is sort of the supply chain element. And she said, oh, it's easier to do that in a sort of domestic context, in a, you know, relatively more simple supply chain than it would be if you have an overseas supply chain. Now, the traditional approach with supply chains has been basically the code of conduct and social auditing approach, where you'd have a code of conduct that a supplier needs to abide by, and then there might be some social auditing to sort of verify working conditions. Now, could you talk to the, I suppose, the shortcomings of that approach as it has existed for a few decades? And could you talk a bit to, I suppose, the way in which CAF transcends that existing model?
Sure, yeah, and actually I think the point you're making about domestic supply chains, you know, and the relatively short nature of the cleaning supply chain is interesting and relevant, because I mean, the work I've done in Australia and the UK around supply chains, often organisations want to be seen to do the right thing around their international supply chains, especially retailers, for example, but don't really see their domestic supply chains as something that's as worthy of attention. So full credit to CAF and for pushing this issue, I think. So yeah, in terms of the code of conduct approach, yeah, this is, I mean, of all the mechanisms that exist that seek to provide governance over labour issues and supply chains, the code of conduct approach is by far the most common and by far the most ineffective. The reasons for it, the ineffectiveness are relate to some of the things we've already talked about. The monitoring enforcement mechanisms tend to be very weak under the code of conduct approach. Standards are either not enforced. You know, an organisation might have a code of conduct in place for its suppliers and contractors, but doesn't actually follow up, or does so in a way, as Shelley says, that is not very effective, asking the suppliers if they're complying or not. Or they're monitored in a way that are very easily avoided. So, for example, an organisation might engage an auditor who wants more business, so might not do as rigorous a job as like a union might, for example, Or the terms of the audit might be, we're going to audit you, a letter or an email to the contractor, we're going to audit you in a week or in 2 days. And it's often quite easy for the auditor to clean up, for the contractor to clean up their practices. Examples of suppliers or contractors having 2 sets of books is a common feature that emerges from the case studies, the research I've done and the research others have done as well. So the enforcement mechanisms are typically very weak. And often, and relating to this, or do not always at least, apply to the subcontractors. So the terms of the enforcement or the enforcement mechanisms might apply to the contractor, but don't necessarily apply to other organisations in the supply chain. For a cleaning company, a cleaning contractor might engage subcontractors in order to to fill variations in demand, and it's important to ensure that those supply chain management principles applied down the contracting chain. They often don't when it comes to codes of conduct. Another weakness is that codes of conduct rarely actively encourage input and participation from the workers themselves or from their representatives. And as I said in my answer to your first question, one of those principles, worker involvement and trade union input is really a key consistent finding from the research about the effectiveness of where supply chain governance mechanisms are effective. And that tends to be a differentiating feature of codes of conduct. Because they're set up by the organisation unilaterally, they don't often have a role for third parties. And I think that's really highlights the importance of a multi-stakeholder approach like CAF, where you have multiple stakeholders, including unions, involved in the process. I guess the final thing I'd say is that the research evidence quite consistently indicates that codes of conduct are primarily adopted by organisations whose motivation is to promote their CSR credentials rather than promoting decent work. So for organisations who want to promote decent work in the supply chains, engaging with multi-stakeholder initiatives like CAF is an important step forward, and something I'd recommend to the panelists in the room who might be considering this or not.
Thanks, Chris, for that explanation. Laurie, I wanted to follow up a bit more on what you mentioned before about the vulnerabilities that migrant workers experience, and specifically in the context of sort of cleaning, obviously, as that's the theme of today. So I suppose a layman's interpretation, obviously, is oftentimes that, well, there's language barriers, language difficulties, and you already alluded to the fact that, some of them think that they might be in breach of the law, for example, by being underpaid, which obviously is this double thing, really problematic fact. So, but can you talk a bit more to sort of the elements that go beyond that? Because as I mentioned, that's just, I suppose, just one part of it, sort of language difficulties and not being familiar with your rights. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Sure. And in fact, I think there is a kind of a misconception that workers don't know their rights. They don't know what the minimum wage is, or they think it's what the minimum wage is in their country or whatever. And in fact, we asked them what they thought the minimum wage was. So they did have misconceptions about their visa, which is just, I think, a broad-based fear that they could do something wrong that might put their visa at risk, but they actually do know what the minimum wage is, and they know they're not getting it. So 3/4 of international students were able to correctly identify the minimum wage in our survey, for instance. So there are some who may not know, but by and large, they know, and they know that they're not getting it. Look, and I think people also think that English language is an issue. But we found substantial underpayment. And this is much broader than in cleaning, but we found substantial underpayment and a failure to take action or make a complaint or, reported in every major nationality group of the international students and backpackers that we surveyed. So including those from Western countries, including those from English speaking countries. In fact, only 15% of migrants said themselves that they didn't take action because their English wasn't good enough. So, and we offered our survey in 12 languages. So I think that, English language is also not the main barrier by any means. So what is? I think that the main thing is that, frankly, the system for complaints, the sort of government system for complaints and wage recovery, doesn't work very well. There are significant costs and risks in coming forward, and they aren't outweighed by the potential benefits that you might get from coming forward and actually seeing the wages at the end of the day. I mean, I've discussed the risk of visa loss, and of course, workers also fear losing their job as well if they make a complaint. But added to that is the time and energy that it takes to make a complaint, or even work out what to do and how to make a complaint, or who to ask for help, or maybe paying someone, and the financial cost of perhaps paying someone for help, or, a lawyer, for instance, or even paying a court fees to try and actually recover money yourself. So that the costs and risks are there, and then the system just doesn't regularly deliver outcomes for workers and for migrant workers in particular. So of the very small number, when we asked workers whether they'd taken any action, the very small number who said that they did, we asked them what happened. And of those who actually did complain about underpayment, only 2 in 5 recovered anything at the end of the day. 3 in 5 recovered nothing. And so, I mean, there are complex reasons why that is. I'll just very briefly sort of point to the Fair Work Ombudsman, which is the national labour regulator. It's not sufficiently resourced. It doesn't have enough inspectors, conducting sort of investigations across all of the workplaces in this country. And it isn't sufficiently resourced to respond to migrant workers' requests for assistance. It doesn't see itself as a worker advocate. It will routinely, when a migrant worker calls up the Fair Work Ombudsman, it will routinely recommend self-help as the best way for the international student, to try and sort of recover their wages, that they sort of will say, look, you can go to court, you can write a letter to your employer. And I mean, international students and basically any contract cleaners for that matter are not well equipped to make a complaint by themselves to their employer or take their employer to court. And in a supply chain, if they're, when their employer might be a subcontractor, a very small contractor, a small employer, workers may be paid in cash, they may not get a pay slip, they may have no evidence of the fact that they've actually been underpaid. And unfortunately, in many cases, the Fair Work Ombudsman doesn't, when you come to the Fair Work Ombudsman with a lack of evidence, the Fair Work Ombudsman doesn't necessarily take the approach that suggests underpayment. Often the regulator will basically take the approach that there's not enough evidence for them to proceed in investigating. So basically, the idea that underpayment is routinely detected and addressed out there in the labour market is just not the case, especially in supply chains, which suggests the need for something more that is going to ventilate these claims and kind of bring to the attention of, the university at the top of the supply chain, and others that these contraventions are happening, whether it's sort of, underpayment or whatever else, and then doing something about it. The workers are just not in a position to make sure those complaints are sort of heard for the most part.
Thanks, Laurie. And I'll stay with you. And what we'll do now is we'll actually move to the questions that have been posed by the audience. So I'll stay with you, Laurie. I'm sorry, did I call you Shelley before? Did I just?
No, I don't think so.
I'm probably having a stroke. So you mentioned that about 10% of cleaners had the passport confiscated, which is something that your research shows. Now, the question from the audience is that they were interested in sort of seeing a comparison between industries in terms of which industries are most notorious in terms of passport confiscation. For examples mentioned in the question are hospitality and farming. So can you give us some insight into that?
Sure, and I should just make sure. I mean, I know I was throwing a lot of statistics around. It wasn't the case that 10% of cleaners' passports were confiscated. I'm sorry if I misspoke. 10% of those whose passports were confiscated were cleaners. So, I mean, it is a smaller proportion. And if you give me a moment, I can try and work out the numbers. But I mean, I think that it is a smaller number, but nevertheless demonstrates. And I mean, this was just our survey of the thousands of temporary visa holders who who happen to respond, it's happening out there, and not where you would think. I mean, so yeah, cleaning wasn't the most prevalent industry. It was reported more in horticulture, which probably won't come as a surprise to some of you, and also actually in food services, which is more surprising as well. So just to kind of indicate that this, I mean, it's shocking that it happens at all. It does, it doesn't happen to 10%. It's, a far smaller proportion, but nevertheless, among all of the international students working as cleaners, they were reporting that it happens. And, and I guess unlike in horticulture, where perhaps there are some complexities about the accommodation provider also being the employer, where you're at a hostel and you've given your passport to the front desk, there's absolutely no reason why an international student working as a cleaner should be, having their passport held by the contractor. So, the fact that this is happening in all is absolutely shocking and indicates like a much greater need for oversight.
Thanks for that, Laurie. Question for you, Shelley. So on the basis of your interviews and your surveys and your sort of your in-depth exploration of, the costing process and the procurement process at Australian universities, what are sort of the indications that universities are aware of sort of, baseline things such as award rates? Are they also aware that in their costing process, they need to allocate, uniforms, chemicals, all that sort of stuff? So is there that degree of sophistication in that costing process for cleaning contracts? Or do you see that, what we spoke about before, whether there's this sole focus on price, and on the basis of that, the tender is being selected? Yeah,
I think this is a great question, and it gets really to the, I guess, a core of, a problem for cleaners. So all of our respondents thought that they were paying enough. So they didn't think that they were setting low budgets for cleaning or security. And most of them actually talked about requiring, like, that they have new tendering processes which require the tenders to account for legal labour costs. However, I guess, a really big problem is that the procurement officers, the personnel who are responsible for managing these contract processes, do not have expertise in awards. And, we know every award is different. There are different rates for different things. So they don't know how to budget for all the things that are mentioned here, the statutory costs, such as cleaning equipment, uniforms, chemicals, and so forth. And so they actually expressed a lack of confidence and a need for further expertise. And the number one thing that in interviews and in the survey that respondents said that they wanted from CAF was exactly this kind of expertise. How do they account for all of these aspects of award costs that they know that they're currently not able to check against what the contractor is telling them? So definitely a gap, definitely something that CAF can provide, and is really, really important, because it's a reason why underpayment is occurring.
Thank you, Shelley. Question for you, Chris, because you mentioned the role of organized labor, trade unions in sort of in the multi-stakeholder initiative, CAF specifically today. The question relates to whether there's any research out there that goes to the topic of perhaps some reluctance among employers to work together with unions to ensure compliance, and if there is that resistance, what can be done to overcome that. And the second part of that question relates to the use of external supply chain auditing platforms, and SEDEX is mentioned as an example here. And I suppose the question is to what extent that those platforms can be effective. Oh, you're on mute, Chris.
Apologies for that. Yeah, thanks for the question. So yes, there has been research done about the question of contractor or supplier reluctance or resistance. I've done some research on this myself and have found consistently that is often fierce resistance. We're talking here about industries that are largely de-unionised. Cleaning, security, Laura's examples of farm work, hospitality. These are industries where union membership is in the single figures, if that, it wasn't always the case. Looking at these industries going back to the 1990s, often much higher rates of unionisation, and what led to that decline, or various factors, but often the outsourcing of services on a cost competitive basis, whereby contractors have a financial or economic incentive to avoid unionisation. What do unions do? They ensure workers get paid in accordance with the law. That will often, especially for non-compliant businesses or in industries where non-compliance is prevalent, will force up costs. Contractors, therefore, very resistant or reluctant to engage with unions. What can be done about it? Well, what can be done, what has been done, some of the best practice examples, going back to the very beginning, there are some really good examples in the UK, for example, of where retailers or lead firms have required contractors to engage with unions. So where a lead firm takes its commitment to decent work and compliance seriously and recognises the role that unions play in achieving that, then they will say to the contractor or put in the terms of the commercial contract that you've got to work with the union and not resist union attempts to organise the workforce, because this is part of the solution. So, and this getting back to the question that Shelley just answered about the contracts, there's often a disconnect. Another kind of thing that comes out of the research is there's a disconnect between companies, lead firms who say, we express a commitment to CSR and compliance. We have in place a code of conduct that requires you to do suppliers to comply with these activities on one hand, and the other, maintaining commercial contracts that make it very hard to meet those standards. So it's working with unions at a lead firm level and ensuring that your contracts are not so simply tendered on the basis of cost unionisation are really important. On the question of SEDEX, I mean, SEDEX is better than SEDEX is a organisation that works with lead firms to improve their supply chain compliance. I'd say that model is certainly better than a code of conduct approach, but it's not nearly as good as a multi-stakeholder approach, because from what I can gather, SEDEX doesn't have its governance structure. It does not involve organised labour. It's the things that the framework that it uses does ask suppliers and contractors, does encourage them to not resist unions, to emphasise that workers have rights to join unions. These are principles of the ILO and of the UN Global Compact and the SDGs and these initiatives, but nevertheless, it's not having that governance structure that incorporates organised labour and then involves unions in the enforcement and compliance processes, I think, is a weakness of SEDEX. So it's better than a code of conduct, but it's not as good as a multi-stakeholder approach like CAF.
Thank you, Chris. We've got only a few minutes left before I'll ask each of the panelists to give their closing remarks on today's session. The final question I'll pose to Poonam. So maybe Poonam, you can turn your camera on if you can. And it's basically a combination of two questions that have been posed. Now, one of them is a question with regards to, it's a broad question, what's your recommendation for conducting a thorough audit? And the second one relates to international students. And I suppose there's an educational question there in terms of how CAF is helping to, educate, I suppose, not just international students or migrant workers that come to Australia to work, but, how are you providing information about award rates to those people that are part of CAF? So two questions: thorough audit, and what's the educational initiative from CAF directed towards international students?
Sure. So first question on thorough audits. I guess the key thing here, so already Chris in particular has spoken a lot about the role of audits and social audits, and a lot of the other participants have spoken about the role of worker voice. I think there is a place for audits, but you do need to be mindful that if there isn't a genuine worker element to that audit or that assessment, you're not going to find out all the information. So we have analysed compliance data that we've collected over the past few years, and overwhelmingly, it's close to 80% of issues are identified by workers in conversations that we have with them. And I'll say conversations rather than interviews, because we do, you know, in a sense, something that could be considered social audits, where we go out and we talk about issues and try and find out what issues exist. But more times than not, we're going to find issues when you're having a conversation about someone's uni course that they're doing, or the other job that they're working, or something about their home life, or about their, you know, family overseas. That's when you pick up on clues that there could be a non-compliance going on. So our approach is very much about engagement with workers, not just interviewing workers. And that's why we engage so heavily with the union, because a lot of the union representatives that come out with us to do worker engagement, they're former cleaners themselves. You know, they know what issues exist. They've experienced those issues, so they know what to look for. So if we're talking about a thorough, I guess, I'll say compliance approach rather than audit approach, what you're trying to do is you're trying to change culture. And that's the approach that we're taking. So that's never going to happen through audits, because they're always point in time. You really got to work on all stakeholders in that supply chain to try and build that culture within the supply chain. Of course, including workers in this, and workers are critical to that, but also other tiers of that supply chain. So, you know, looking at that procurement process, looking at the contract management, looking at employment policies, and making sure that all of those act as like on a continuous pathway of development, you know, trying to improve, I guess, their standards and the way that they operate. In terms of education that we provide, look, we do that as part of our worker engagement work. When we're out on site with cleaners at CAF certified buildings, we do worker engagement, we do education. We also work with cleaners. We have basically our most effective ongoing compliance mechanism is something called a CAF representative. It's a cleaner that's nominated by other cleaners to receive training, support and allowance and guidance to understand what the CAF standard is, but then also talk to workers, and it's someone that other cleaners trust, so they can bring up issues with them. So they, I guess, receive education that they're able to then pass on to other cleaners, because of course CAF can't be there all the time at a work site. The union can't be there all the time at a work site. So we're really trying to embed that within the workforce itself. So we do that at CAF sites, but also we partner with organisations like the union, with the Fair Work Ombudsman, with the property owners and with the contractors themselves, so that every single stakeholder along that supply chain is part of that education process with their cleaners. It's not simply up to CAF to educate cleaners, it's everyone that's working on educating cleaners. And we work with also like-minded people and like-minded institutions, like a lot of the people on the panel today, to also bring that education to workers, you know, on whatever scale we can. It will be on a much larger scale when we move to portfolio certification in the next year or so.
Thanks, Poonam, for answering those two questions combined into one. Well done. We've come to the point where I'm just going to ask our panelists to give their closing thoughts, and rather than just for them to give their closing thoughts generally about, you know, the state of everything, you know, in the Australian contract cleaning industry, I'd like to ask them each the question, because one thing I think which has come really to the forefront in today's discussion is how important worker representation is in the context of, you know, the cleaning industry, but more broadly in verifying working conditions and making sure no one's being exploited. So I'd like each of them to give each of them 1 minute, and I'm going to be very strict with the timekeeping, and ask them where they, how they see worker representation evolving over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years. Laurie, would you like to kick off first?
Just a small question. Look, I guess I would just say in my minute that, you know, I mean, our methodology was to go straight to workers, and, you know, and as I just would underscore what Poonam has already said, you can't look at, I mean, we felt that we couldn't look at court cases or, you know, Fair Work Ombudsman, you know, data and annual reports to see how many workers are underpaid. The labour contraventions just don't surface there. You know, you need to go straight to the source. And I think that, you know, CAF is uniquely positioned to do that, you know, to meaningfully engage with workers. And that is it's really the only way, I think, to really understand what is going on in terms of working conditions. And I mean, of all of the workers who said that they didn't take any action in our survey, half of them said that they would if it was possible. And so I do think that, if you're not learning about worker complaints, at the top of the supply chain, or, as in a university, from a grievance mechanism, or, through other channels, or a desk-based audit, then I think you're not sort of looking hard enough, because I think it is there. I think the workers want to, they want to make sure that information surfaces. And I think that, but they need a safe, secure and meaningful mechanism to do it. And that's what CAF provides.
Thanks, Laurie. Chris, did you want to add to that?
I think in terms of the future of worker representation over the next 5 years, big question. I think workers are becoming more empowered. We see that, last few months, a lot more industrial action. We have a government in office now who is more supportive of worker rights than the predecessors. I think so. Look, I think it's important for organisations to get ahead of the curve. The climate, the policy framework suggests that the worker empowerment is happening, and hopefully it does happen in the cleaning industry to a greater extent. But on the question, so one thing I would just kind of finish with is to say that one of the areas where businesses, organisations or lead firms have slipped up in this area is that they haven't treated worker complaints seriously enough. They've often dismissed them as a one-off rather than something that's systematic. If you find if there's evidence or indication of a one or a small segment of the workforce being mistreated, don't assume that that's just a contained issue. It could be an indication of, it could be the tip of the iceberg. We've seen that in many industries of where instances that have been dismissed as one-offs, like in farms, for example, or like in hospitality, have actually been reflections of major system-wide problems of underpayment and non-compliance. So to take the voice of workers seriously is really important for getting on top of this issue.
Thank you, Chris. And Shelley, you get the last word today.
Thank you. Rather than saying something about the future of worker representation, I just want to stress that a lot of cleaners are the students that are enrolled at the universities where the cleaning is occurring. So universities have a double duty to listen to them, however that might occur. So that might occur through CAF, it might occur through surveys, it might occur through having meetings with them. But again, the opportunity for universities is that these are not workers in a factory in Bangladesh or somewhere else. These are these are workers who are right there. So the ease of carrying out worker consultation is just so much greater than in other sectors. And in my view, this is a really good starting point for universities who are trying to work out priority areas for addressing modern slavery risks or labour abuse. Start with the workers who are right there in front of you and that you can access, and develop processes that work well with them before going on to workers in other high-risk sectors. The duty is so clear and the methods are already laid out for you.
Thank you. Thanks, Shelley. Well, I think we've come to the end of our webinar today. I'm going to give myself a little pat on the back due to the fact that it's 1:14 and we meant to finish at 1:15. So it's not a given, I think, to wrap up in time. So thank you, Poonam and the wider CAF organization for having me to moderate this event. And obviously, thank you to our big thanks to our speakers, Laurie, Shelley, and Chris, to shine their light on this very important matter. And yeah, I think we'll leave it at that for today. Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Martijn, as well, for moderating. Thanks, everyone, for joining.